So we are here. We have Grandpa Hewitt. How you doing? Harold Hewitt. sorry. And then we have Alyssa Stevens and Jacob Rains and then Mike Hewitt. Me. And basically we're here with Grandpa Hewitt, Harold Hewitt. How are you doing? And
surviving.
We're here to tell you, ask you about a few stories. And so get some. You've told us so many stories. I want them on tape eventually. So that's why we are here. So,
am I represented by a lawyer?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. So let's start it back at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Well, the first 4 years of my life was in Nebraska.
Okay.
I was born at Milford, Nebraska, which is west of Lincoln. And then we moved to my grandmother's farm at Rising City, Nebraska.
Mm-hmm. When were you born?
In 1922.
1922.
And I don't remember very little of those first 4 years. However, I have a vivid memory. The house that we lived in had drop siding. That's a thick board on one side and thin on the other. Mm-hmm. And over the years it had warped, and a swarm of bees found a way to get in to the inner wall between the two walls, and they filled that wall full of honey. Mm-hmm. And for years they had been working on this, and I had a brother that was 6 years older than I, and he one day took me out in the front yard and told me to stand there, and he took a broom and went up and beat the side of the house, and then he ran down on the orchard and left me standing out there. And if I'd been allergic to bee sting, I would have died right there because I really got stung. Mm-hmm. But that's one of the few memories I have before we moved to Wyoming.
And were they in the inside of the house as well? So were there?
No, they weren't inside. They were between the walls,
two.
Between the two walls.
Gotcha. So they weren't making. Were there a few of them indoors? Because I even see a few wasps indoors these days.
Well, no, they never got in the house. They were just using the wall as a hive. Mm-hmm. And
then when was that? When you were 6, 7?
4.
Oh, no.
You were
4.
4?
4.
Wow.
That's
a pretty good memory because I can't remember when I was 4.
No, not much
at all.
I actually remember getting stung by a bee when we lived in Leavenworth, which was before I was 4, or down in Oklahoma, which was before I was 4 too.
Well, maybe that's something that sticks with you.
Yes, getting stung is pretty. That sticks.
Before we go too much further, can you tell us about your parents and your siblings and just the makeup of your family before we get into a lot of stories from that time frame?
Okay. Well, I was the youngest of 7 living children, and for example, my oldest sister was a senior in high school the year I started to school. Mm-hmm. So she was 11 years ahead of me, and that was a big advantage to me because one of our favorite pastimes was playing school. And she taught me to read and write and spell, add and subtract and multiply and divide before I ever started to school. Mm-hmm. So the first 2 years I was in elementary school, it was boring, because the teacher would never call on me because she knew I had the answers. But going back, my mother and dad were old-fashioned. They were a generation removed as we are from you, and my father was a musician of sorts. He played the trombone, and very well too. And 3 different presidential elections, my father played the trombone and traveled with William Jennings Bryan. He was the Democrat candidate for President of the United States and traveled all over the country campaigning with him.
How far did he travel?
What do you mean?
Like, how many states did he? I mean, back then, I imagine a lot of people didn't travel a whole lot. So,
well, they had a special train
Oh, gotcha.
for the candidates,
Gotcha.
and but he never made it to the White House.
Yeah.
And my mother was one of the few girls of her age that went to high school. The girls didn't go to high school in those days, and you had to go to high school to be a teacher.
and
So-
when were your parents born?
My dad was born in 1875, and my mother was born in 1878.
Oh, wow. So,
So you take 78 from 100 would be
yeah, they were 44 in their 50s.
right.
He was in about his 50s.
My mother was 44 when I was born.
Wow. Wow. I always thought you have kids young, and having kids a little older these days is the norm, but I guess you back then just as much, I guess.
Well, they had children for much longer.
True.
So they started young and then continued, because he said his oldest sibling was 11 years older than her.
Still at
Older than
11,
him.
he was in his
Yeah.
40s. Yeah, crazy.
And I had 4 brothers, and by the time I got to be a teenager, they were all gone. I mean, they had left home and so forth and so on. So I was a bratty, spoiled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Still am, huh?
So your mother went to high school. Did she graduate?
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay, because your sister graduated. You said she was a senior in high school. That's really, I mean, that's really interesting.
All 3
you
of my
have-
sisters graduated.
Yeah.
I was the only boy that graduated.
Hmm.
My 3 brothers never graduated from high school.
Wow.
So, before you, I mean, obviously, he was of an age where the World War I, did he have anything to do anything with that? Or,
No, he was too old for World War One,
mm-hmm.
and he had all of us children, or most of us. But he was the son. My grandfather was a Civil War
Mm-hmm.
veteran, and I have 2 honorable discharges from the Union Army. He enlisted in the infantry and went down south and walked all over the South. And the stories varied as to whether he was wounded or just got ill. But anyway, the Union Army discharged him on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have organizations like they have now that
Right.
get him back home or anything. So,
So they just dropped him off in the South?
right, and colored, not a colored, a Southern woman took him in and helped him get his health back. And then he made his way back up north and re-enlisted, this time in the cavalry. He said he walked all over the South, and next time he was going to ride.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was very active in the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. This was like the American Legion and so forth of today. And they attended all of the reunions and so forth. but no, my dad was of military age when the Spanish-American War broke out. And he was drafted, and he had to go to Lincoln. But when he got to Lincoln, he had a cold in his head. He couldn't hear anything, so they wouldn't take him. So that was how he evaded. Anyway,
May have lucked out.
right.
And so Samuel is your grandfather,
Samuel,
which would be our great-great-grandfather, and he was in the Civil War. And if your father wasn't born until 75, Samuel had your father pretty late. Because if he was in the war, he had to have been 20 in the 1850s, 60s. So he didn't have Samuel. I mean, he didn't have your father until he was 40s. Am I doing the math right?
I don't know.
It has to be. But yeah, okay.
Well, there are stories.
Did you ever meet Samuel?
He held me when I was
Gotcha.
a baby.
Okay.
I don't remember him, of course.
Gotcha.
But there are rumors that the woman that took him in and nursed him back to health later came north, and they met and married.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that is true or not, you'd have to take blood tests and everything to
Yeah.
DNA to verify. But my mother said that Grandma Hewitt told her that she and Grandpa got married in Des Moines, Iowa, and she had a little girl when they got married.
Mm-hmm.
And so my dad never knew. He lived to be 90, and he never knew that his sister was only a half-sister.
You guys have any other questions about him growing up, or
Well, I wanted you to
our
run through the rest of your siblings.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, okay.
because I'm sure you're going to tell stories and you're going to start throwing out names. So
Okay.
let's just start at you said you're the youngest. Why don't you work your way up?
Okay, but my next older was Richard, and all people have personalities. Richard was a giving person. He went out of his way to make life pleasant for me, and he made me toys and all that kind of stuff. And next to Richard was Mildred, my youngest sister. And Mildred just passed away here a few weeks ago, and she was 100. And then from Mildred, my favorite sister was Lucille. If you talk to the nieces and nephews, they'll all say that Lucille was their favorite, because she was always thinking of them and figuring out ways and means of helping them and so forth and so on. After Lucille comes Paul, and I can't say much about Paul. He was very selfish and self-centered. He should never have married, but he did, and had 7 children, and he never provided for them. And then from Paul, the oldest sister that I knew was Gladys, and she was a senior when I was a first grader, and she had gone the entire requirement in the state of Wyoming And so she was entitled to what do you call it? Scholarship. So the scholarship was to Grand Island Business College. So she packed her suitcase and was off to Grand Island and found a husband and never came back home to live. And my oldest brother was Burton, and I hardly remember him. He was tall and good-looking, and my mother said that she couldn't have asked for a finer son than Burton. But one incident ruined his life. We were living in Nebraska yet, and I had a cousin who was the same age as Burton. And one Sunday they wanted to go swimming. And the parents told him that he couldn't go swimming. And my brother said, well, if you'll let him go swimming, I'll look after him. So the two of them went down on the Blue River to a place, a swimming hole. And Burton his cousin got swept under, and Burton tried desperately to rescue him, but he drowned, and so his parents blamed Burton for the loss of their son, and it affected his life. And so he left home early, and I very vaguely remember him.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the size of our family. And
That's a crazy story.
So did he never come back? You never saw him again, or?
yes, we saw him later on. We were living in Colorado at that time, and he and his bride came back to our house, and the sheriff was after him. He and this girl had gotten married against her parents' wishes, and the parents had swore out a warrant for his arrest. And our house sat within 50 feet of the state line. So they traced him into the state of Wyoming, and they called the sheriff in Wyoming, and he came out. And I remember this very vividly because it's the only time I ever saw my father lie. And my dad went out to the car, and the sheriff said, George, if you'll tell me that Burton isn't in that house, I'll leave. And my dad said, I'm telling you, he's not here. But he was sitting in the kitchen.
Yeah.
The parents of the girl relented many years that they had disrupted the normal lives of my brother and his wife. And they corresponded with my folks for many years trying to find out where their daughter was. But Burton and his wife disappeared, and nobody knows where they went to live, or of course they're long dead now.
So what was the last year that you saw him? When you were in Colorado?
I must have been 10 or 11.
So is that you can just make a warrants for arrests if you didn't like what people were doing? Or was she young? Too young?
She was underage.
Okay,
right.
gotcha.
Now, that was
and what is underage? Like under 16 or?
Different states
Yeah.
have different. Kentucky and some of those places,
Okay.
you can marry when you're 13.
Right. Interesting. Fascinating. That is fascinating. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was just you could just do warrants out for any.
Yeah,
Might be
like
back
that.
then. Who knows?
Didn't you say you had to have great grandma's consent to marry grandma because she was 17? Was it you that was telling me that? You had to have consent? No, somebody had to have consent. Okay, never mind. Because they were 17
Yeah.
to marry.
So you went through high school.
Yes.
Sorry, is there any other questions?
Not yet.
Questions? Okay, gotcha. I didn't know. I'm trying to go through. I'm trying to think if I missed any questions from an early age. But so high school, you got through high school,
Right.
and then you went on to college, correct?
No.
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 He joined the Navy.
Okay, you joined the Navy.
Right. Joined the Navy. As I say, our farm was mostly in Colorado, but part of it was in Wyoming. So, but there were 2 deeds, one for the land in Colorado and one for the land in Wyoming. And so when we moved out there, my dad bought a schoolhouse, a country schoolhouse. And it was just as the last day of school, they shut and locked the doors. And so he bought the whole thing and moved it onto our farm. And he and my oldest brother took the tall ceilings out and reduced them to 7 foot or 8 foot, whatever.
Wait, you said you moved it?
Yes, moved it about 12 miles.
How did you do that? I mean, I imagine that would be an undertaking today. So,
It was an undertaking in those days. A farm wagon, you can visualize, they have what they call a reach, which ties the back 2 wheels with the front. They can expand them. So they took 2 farm wagons and telephone poles, actually light poles, big, and jacked it up and put these under, and that's how they transported it. But I can't imagine how they got it off that bluff, because a house is going to. Anyway, they moved it, and they put it on the 5-acre strip of land we had in Wyoming. And because we were going to school, we wanted to go to school in Wyoming.
I'm sorry. How far?
12 miles.
Oh, so you're right on the edge of Colorado to Wyoming because you moved it from Colorado to Wyoming.
No, they had the deed. They had a deed that went across both properties.
Gotcha.
So they had 2 deeds.
Okay, gotcha.
that
But they
land was
moved the
on.
schoolhouse 12 miles.
And put it in the Wyoming strip.
Wow.
And I don't care how small of a schoolhouse it was.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
Yeah.
it was about 24 by 40. I
Still,
guess.
that's pretty.
that's big enough.
Yeah.
But anyway, that put us in Wyoming, in the Wyoming School District. So all of us kids went to Carpenter, Wyoming, in my case, for the first 5 grades. So when I finished the 5th grade, my dad was well known in certain circles, and a guy by the name of, it don't matter, drove out from Omaha and told my dad, George, if you don't move your house off of that 5 acres, which is tied up in a huge mortgage, you'd stand to lose your house. So that summer, they jacked up the house and moved it from Wyoming to Colorado.
The house you were living in or the schoolhouse?
The schoolhouse.
Schoolhouse, okay.
Which is what we were living in.
Oh, okay.
And we moved it from Wyoming to Colorado. And that put us into a different school district, and of course, a different. So I had to start going to Hereford, Colorado, for 6th, 7th, and 1/2 of 8th grade. And so I spent 2.5 years going to Colorado to school. and my youngest sister was still at home, and she had to go 15 miles to Grover, Colorado, to high school. And that year, I had a grandmother, my Grandpa Hewitt's widow. She was the only grandmother I ever knew, but she was not my favorite. She was contrary and cantankerous. And she was of the old school that a son done what his parents wanted him to do. Mm-hmm. And so that summer, winter really, my dad got a letter from her. My dad had one brother that lived in Oklahoma, and he had taken all of Grandma he was going to take. And he told her, I don't know where you're going to spend the winter, but you're not going to spend it with us. So she wrote to my dad, who was the oldest son, and said, you will come to Nebraska and take care of me. Mm-hmm. So that disrupted our whole lives. My dad had to rent out the farm, get rid of a lot of stuff, and we moved to Rising City, Nebraska, which is 60 miles west of Omaha.
Really quick. So you were saying one girl went 15 miles to school, and I know there were cars back then, but not a lot of cars. Did you guys have a car, or how did she get to school for 15 miles? Because 15 miles is a lot now.
School bus.
Oh, a school bus. Okay.
In her case, she rode the bus from our farm to Hereford, Colorado, 5 miles, and then got off of one bus and got on another to go another 10 miles down to the high school.
Sounds something like Jake.
Yeah.
Going to Linwood.
And so we moved to Nebraska and tried to make a living on 80 acres. And okay, now you're ready for the car. We're going to get a car now. Uh-huh. And as I said before, Grandma was a Civil War widow.
Mm-hmm. So what year was this in right now?
This would be 1937.
Okay.
And
so the middle of the Depression on top of that.
Right, the Depression on top of that.
And then you have like pre-World War II stuff starting politically to heat up, correct?
Oh yes, we used to listen to Hitler on the radio. Couldn't understand him, but you could get the temperature of his tone and so forth.
Gotcha.
So we moved out on this farm, the same farm that the bees were in, and of course everything revolved around Grandma, and she said she had to have a car. So you couldn't take her car shopping, so they called the Ford dealer in David City, Nebraska, and he brought a catalog out and said, here's what we sell. And she was interested only in the price. And she found that the cheapest thing in there was a 37 Ford pickup. There was two pickups in those days, a 60 and an 85. The 85 had an engine in it, and the 60 had a washing machine engine in it. And so that was the cheapest thing, and she said, I'll take that. And he said, well, and the heater will be $8. And she said, don't want the heater, I don't need it. I'm only going to be in there for a little bit, and George don't need it. So we drove that pickup for years without a heater in it. No
in Nebraska
defrosting or anything. And so anyway, my mother was very kind. I never heard her say a crossword to my grandmother. Not so Grandma to her, but Grandma had a radio. We couldn't afford a radio. And when my mother would come into the room to listen to the news, Grandma would get up and shut the radio off. Just mean.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Grandma fell and broke her hip. And in those days, they never bothered to set it. Mm-hmm. They just put her in bed and took care of her till she passed away. And we stayed 2 years, I believe, after she passed away, and farmed the 80 acres. Then my dad got a letter from the Federal Land Bank of Omaha saying if he didn't move back to the farm in Colorado, they were going to foreclose the mortgage. Mm-hmm. So we had to turn around now and terminate our stay in Nebraska when I was in the middle of my junior year and moved back to the Colorado farm. And that destroyed any eligibility for me to get a scholarship. I was well on the road to getting a scholarship if we'd stayed in Nebraska. So we moved back to Wyoming, and I spent the last half of my junior year and my senior year in Carpenter, Wyoming. And again, my dad went to the school board. We were living in Colorado, and he went to the Colorado school board and told them that I preferred to go to Wyoming to school because that was where most of my friends were. And the school board met and they said, well, we'll pay his tuition to the Wyoming school, but we will not pay his transportation. So the last year and a half, I had to walk to the nearest bus line. Junior, it was 1.5 miles, and senior, it was about 3 miles. You've never walked 3 miles against the wind when it was 40 below zero.
Yeah, that far up there. Yeah.
It wakes you up.
Yeah.
But I survived.
But somewhere in there, I remember hearing a story about you driving, or Grandpa, your dad, I think, driving that truck with no heater and the having to clean off the window.
Oh yes, okay. When we were in Nebraska, as I say, I was a junior in high school, but my dad was old-fashioned and he wouldn't let me drive. So a friend of mine let me drive his dad's car, and I knew how to drive. And the day we moved back to Colorado, we loaded as much stuff on that pickup as possible. And there was my dad and my mother and I. And we started out with, it was way below freezing. I'd say close to zero. And of course we had the windows up so that the inside of the cab all frosted. And you had to keep opening the spot in the windshield. And we stopped in Grand Island, had supper with my sister, and then we went on. We were going to drive the rest of the way, which is going to be all night. And after we left Grand Island, I went to sleep, and all of a sudden I woke up and the truck was bouncing. My dad had gone to sleep and run off the road. And so we got him awake, and I said, you better let me drive. So he reluctantly let me drive, so I drove the rest of the way to Wyoming.
Go ahead.
Oh.
So what was the question?
You mentioned the Depression. We had a double whammy.
Did I hit you?
the Depression hit in 28, and the drought hit about 1930. And we didn't have any crops and no income, no WPA, and so we raised a big garden. And I was telling Melissa the story of my brother Paul. He was about 16, I guess, and we had a row of watermelons all the way through the garden, which was a big garden, probably 50 watermelons. And they weren't ripe yet. And my brother said, I'm hungry for watermelon. I'm going to cut a watermelon. My mother told him, leave that watermelon alone. They're not ripe, and when they get ripe, we'll have watermelon. But my headstrong brother got a butcher knife and went down and plugged a watermelon, and it wasn't ripe. So he plugged another watermelon, and it wasn't ripe. And my mother told him, you leave those watermelons alone, I've told you. Oh, he was going to cut a third one. And my little mother that weighed less than 100 pounds got an axe and went down to the garden and chopped every watermelon in pieces.
Mm-hmm.
She had a temper too.
In the middle of the drought? Was this in the middle of the drought?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure of the year.
What were you normally farming? Just everything, or did you guys have? Did you go through? I mean, were you doing like cows and farm,
yes.
or were you just
Yes,
a little bit of everything?
right. Well, when we moved to Wyoming from Nebraska, Colorado, keep saying,
Mm-hmm.
my dad had a herd of Durham cattle. They're dark red, and about 8 or 9 really nice cows. And of course, he was farming with horses, so we had about 6 horses that had to be transported. And in those days, this was at the tail end of the frontier. The railroads had what they called an immigrant car. An immigrant car was designed to take care of the entire requirements for a family moving. One end of the half of the car was for livestock, and the other half was for household goods and so forth. So my dad rented a immigrant car to move from Nebraska to Wyoming. And the layout of the land was the Union Pacific ran from Omaha to Cheyenne, and then there was the Burlington Railroad run from Cheyenne to Sterling, Colorado. So he would had to went into Cheyenne and switched the car over on the Burlington to get it down to Carpenter. But he was practical, and they put the car on the siding at Burns, and he drove the livestock from Burns, Wyoming, to the farm. That was about 15 miles.
We just did that in Ticket to Ride, I think.
Yeah. Board game.
So you are at home still going to school, and like I said, the political thing is heating up. Now, Hitler at the beginning, what did you think of? I mean, I know Hitler, we found out, was a really bad guy, but back in the early days, did you like, oh, this guy's okay, and then you're slowly like, this guy's getting worse
Crazy.
and worse and getting crazier and crazier? Was there, what was your early, obviously Hitler was a horrible person, but was there any early impressions of Hitler that you...
A lot of people liked him in the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. A lot of people wanted to emulate Hitler.
Right.
He got the trains running on time and so forth and so on. And he was doing a lot of good things.
Do you remember hearing him from a very early age on the radio?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So my daughter, your great-granddaughter, Rebecca, she's getting into World War II right now and a little bit of World War I, and she's asking me questions. And a lot of them I don't know the answer to. So, but that is one of the questions she asked me. She says, why did people follow him? Why did they, how did he become, rise to power? And of course, you watch History Channel. They don't really talk about that. They talk about the war. I don't really know how he started out or how he, I know he started out as a failed art student, but, beyond that.
He was in jail. They had him, he served a jail term in Munich of several years. He wrote Mein Kampf while he was in jail for violating certain German laws and so forth.
So he even captured the imagination of the American people in the mid-30s?
Right. There was a lot of people thought that's what we ought to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And
then when he started marching into people, that was when everything changed.
right.
So then going up to it, I mean, you were born in 1922, so in the 40s you're 18, and 1941. When did you join the Navy? Was it pre-Pearl Harbor, after Pearl Harbor?
Yes, it was after Pearl Harbor.
After Pearl Harbor. Yeah. And so can you go through that a little bit with us, if you mind?
Okay, let's start with my graduation from high school.
Yeah.
I graduated from high school in 40, spring of 40. And my father had started getting ill in 39, and he got progressively worse until the time I graduated from high school. I was doing all of the farming and taking care of the livestock and in effect running the farm. And
did you want to be a farmer?
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, what did you want to do when you graduated?
No. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I didn't want to be a farmer.
Right.
And the Lord worked things out. Anyway, so this winter, the war was on the horizon, the 40 and 41. And they started various programs. For example, I went and learned how to be a welder, subtly and arc welding, and give me something to do and so forth. So then come the summer of 41, and I had to do all the farming, and I was farming about 250 acres. And
now take us a little through that. So did you have machines? Was it a mixture of...
Right. When we moved back from Nebraska, my dad updated to the point that he bought a second-hand farm oil tractor. That was an iron wheels. And so we got rid of the horses except for a team. And so I farmed with this tractor, and what machinery we didn't have, I borrowed from neighbors, which they graciously offered. And so in the summer of 41, I put in a big corn crop, and it was a good growing season, and I had a bumper corn crop. But of course, as you know, no crop, big prices.
Oh, you're fine.
Good crop,
Lower prices.
So anyway, but I had a good corn crop, and
So you learned economics at an early age.
right,
Yeah.
there was an interlude there where I worked for a neighbor. He had a big bean crop. By beans now, we're not talking about soybeans, but rather pinto beans. And pinto beans, you have to handle them by hand, a lot of hand work. And so he came over and wanted to know if I could find a time to come over and work for him for a few days to get his bean crop out of the field. So I rearranged my work and chores and stuff and went over and took my pitchfork and went down to the field. And here was two guys my age. I'd never seen them before. And they were from Missouri. And one of them's grandfather lived at Hillsdale, Wyoming, and they'd come out to Hillsdale to try to find some farm work, and they were working for my neighbor. So I got acquainted with these two boys. One was Bobby Cook, and the other was Merritt Crozier, Crozier. And so naturally, being the same age and same interests and everything, and they had a Model T, not a Model T, a Model A. So we had transportation. I got to run it around with them. And I didn't know that one of them was going to be my brother-in-law. But anyway, on a Friday afternoon, Bobby Cook come by, and he had been let go. And of course, he was working for wages plus board and room. So when he got let go, he lost his home as well as his 3 meals and so forth. And he came over and said that he was going to Cheyenne, that he had heard that the Union Pacific was hiring, and he was going to Cheyenne to make application. He wanted to know if I just wanted to ride along with him, for something to do. And I said, sure. To be back in time to do chores. So I got in the car with him, drove 30 miles to Cheyenne, went to the Union Pacific employment office, and when the two of us walked in, the guy assumed that I was applying for a job. So he brought out 2 clipboards with 2 applications. So I thought, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I filled out the application. I had not talked this over with my folks at all. And I filled out the application. And they took it in and evaluated it and come back out and said, which one of you is Bobby Cook? And Bobby said, I am. Bobby Cook weighed about 200 pounds, could lift his table chairs, and he was strong as an ox. And they said, well, we can't use you, Bobby. You don't have a high school education. So he turned to me and he said, and we will hire you. Can you go to work Monday? So on the way back, we talked it over. I had a corn crop that was still in the field. And in those days, it was all picked by hand. And so Bobby said, Bud, you've got a job now, and I don't have any place to sleep. Why don't you hire me to pick your corn, and I know how to take care of livestock. So that's what we agreed upon when we got home. Told my folks what the plan was, and it was a very chilly evening. That's to put it mildly. I was supposed to stay there and take care of them the rest of their natural lives. Because that's the way they did it in those days.
Yeah.
And so to shorten the story, Bobby Cook put his clothes upstairs in the bedroom and moved in with us. And Sunday afternoon, my folks helped me pack my clothes.
So there was no 2 weeks. It was just, boom, start Monday.
Right.
Pack it Sunday and go.
Right. So they took me to Cheyenne and let me out at 12th and Capitol, which is ground zero,
Right. So what job was it that you got?
working for the railroad.
Oh, okay.
And as a laborer, I started at 43 cents an hour. And
As a laborer, does that mean like building the railroad or running the, like you're not running the train? So
no.
You-
That's just doing all the menial work.
Whatever they tell you to.
Whatever they tell you to. You got it.
peon.
Right. And,
Was 43 cents good, bad?
That sounds like a good rate for back then. I don't
Yeah.
know.
oh, yeah, it was law. They had to pay 43 cents an hour.
Okay.
Oh, so it was minimum,
Minimum
wage.
wage.
Minimum wage.
Yeah,
Okay.
minimum.
Oh, never mind. It's not as good as I thought.
And so they took me to 12th and Capitol and let me out and gave me a quarter.
Call someone who cares.
And drove off.
I'm sure. How much was it to make a phone call? Or did they
No,
have
it was
phones?
like 5 cents or
They
something.
had, we didn't have phones.
Phones,
no,
don't-
no.
phones, gotcha.
No. So I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or sit down on the curb or,
Mm-hmm.
and I picked up my suitcase and started down the street, and here come Providence.
At least you had a suitcase and not a hobo bag.
My older brother, Richard,
Uh-huh.
as I told you, he was a compassionate, and he said, "What are you doing in town?" And I told him the story, and he said, "Well, the solution to you is to go over to the Sterling Hotel." And it was run by a neighbor lady, and he said, "You go to the Sterling Hotel and tell Ethel Ferris your story, and she will give you board and room till you get a check." The railroad paid 1 month and 5 days behind.
Gotcha.
And so then he said, when you do get paid, then you can pay her back 3 weeks at a time until you get caught up. So, but for tonight, you can stay with me. And I thought, stay with me? Where's that? Anyway, he took me up to a flop house.
Mm-hmm.
A flop house is merely army cot and a blanket and a pillow.
Mm-hmm.
I think they charge 10 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent my first night away from home in a flop house. Next morning, I went down to the railroad, and from then on, I stayed at the Sterling Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby done real good. He picked the corn, so forth and so on. In fact, my folks got kind of fond of him. He was a card, and
Mm-hmm.
my dad took a liking to him. Anyway, that was the fall of 41.
Mm-hmm.